Welcome, everybody. Welcome. It is good to see you. It is raining in my part of the world in New England. Hope you're getting better weather where you are. I'm Rachel Scheinerman. I edit My Jewish Learning and A Daily Dose of Talmud. And this is, of course, your 30-minute look back at what we did in the Daf this week. And I think we are in. So I can go ahead and introduce Rabbi Avigayil Halpern, who is going to give us that review in blast. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Hi, everybody. Good to see all of your faces and or names. I'm going to go ahead and share screen for folks who want to be looking that way. All right. Can I just get some nods that you can see that? Excellent. So we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into a little section from 145 and 146. Oh, hello in the chat. Okay. Make sure I wasn't missing anything. Excuse me. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and do a deep dive into the way the rabbis use a verse here. We've been talking a lot about inheritance law, about deathbed gifts. There was a whole melodrama about wedding gifts. And we're going to look at this verse from Proverbs. Proverbs is one of the later books of the Tanakh. It is full of enigmatic verses about the nature of life and wisdom and all kinds of things, which makes it very popular for the rabbis who are trying to prove a point, because they have a wide range of interpretations that are possible in these verses. So I'm going to read you the verse, and I would love to hear some folks out loud, but especially in the chat as well. I would love to hear your interpretation of this verse. So, all the days of the poor are terrible, and for the good-hearted it is always a feast. And if I gave you just this verse, I'm curious, what does this mean? Is this descriptive? Like it's like looking out at the world and saying, this is how things are now? Is it normative? Is it saying things ought to be this way? What does it mean? It seems like the poor are contrasted with the good-hearted. What claim is that making? A lot of questions. And I would love to know, what, if I asked you, give me an interpretation, what would it be? And I'd love as many as possible.
Folks, you can raise your hand if you like. I should be able to see that here. Or you can answer in the chat.
Hey, Michael is saying in the chat.
It does make me wonder if there's another meaning of poor, if oni here is like short for poor of spirit or something, because that would just make more sense for Proverbs to me.
Yes. And there's a lot of that in the chat. We're getting.
Yes. And okay, now I see it coming in. I'm sorry. I didn't.
No, not at all.
Or, yep.
Yeah.
Right.
Valerie
Lynn
says
maybe
attitude,
it's about
attitude.
Internal outlook. Aaron says it's not about economics, it's emotional state. Attitude says Valeria. Yeah. Yep.
And I see a hand raised.
I think a lot of folks are reading it that way. Leia's got her hand up. Hang on, Leia, let me find you.
Yep. I'm wondering if it couldn't be also a bit of wishful thinking. If I'm good enough, if I'm kind-hearted enough, maybe the tables will turn, or maybe I will receive more acknowledgement from people who have more than I do. I think of Psalm 92, when the psalmist goes through all of these things of, am I really like those a tzaddik that is planted like a tzaddik katamar nivrach? It's almost a bit of wishful thinking and also maybe hopeful thinking. But I don't know what the context is of this, so we'll probably have to look at what verses surround this and what the general context is in which this was written. That might give us a clue.
Great. Yeah, context almost always helps when we get a verse taken out of context in the Talmud. We can assume that the rabbis knew the context and were working with it. And yeah, this seems very aspirational in some ways and also very simplistic, right? It's about attitude. Maybe it's about what you deserve. It always works out well if you have a good attitude. Yeah, Randall.
Yes, I support that. All the days of the poor, if your attitude is lousy, every day is crummy. But if your attitude is good, each day is a feast.
Great. Yeah, and we're all noticing, I think, or I'm hearing a lot of people notice that, right, we have Oni, we have the poor, and then we have Tov Lev, the good-hearted. We don't have like the poor and the wealthy. So Rachel, like we were saying earlier, it seems like that the poverty here is likely not material poverty. Okay, now we're going to dive in to some Talmud. We're starting out with a Breita, which is an early rabbinic source that was not codified into the Mishnah, which you might have heard of, and the Talmud often cites them. And so we're jumping away from our verse, but we're going to come back to it. The sages taught in a Breita. There are different types of Torah scholars. There is a scholar who is wealthy in figurative property and wealthy in public renown. This is the master of homiletics, someone who can give a really good Dvar Torah. There is a scholar who is wealthy in coins and wealthy in houses. This is the master of dialectics. That's someone who's really skilled at parsing fine distinctions. There's one who's wealthy in oil and wealthy in hidden stores. This is the master of halachic traditions. This is someone who really grasps Jewish law and can maintain it and is really holding all of that in their memory. So there are all kinds of different ways to be wealthy in Torah, which I really love, both because it's shifting the idea of material wealth to skill and relationship with Torah, and also because it's giving us a range of options, right? We all learn differently. We all find different things in Judaism or in Torah exciting, and we need all of us to have the collective wealth, as it were. But everyone is dependent on the owner of wheat, right? You can have your oil, you can have your coins, you can have your fame, but without basic sustenance, you've got nothing. That is the master of Talmud, who understands the reasons behind the rulings and traditions. And you'll see the non-bolded part, that's the commentary adding on a little bit. So this is just master of Talmud is really the original statement. Great. Lynn, I love what you're saying in the chat. Especially the fourth Torah scholar is the one who knows how to make it work for the community, right? There's a lot of stuff about relationship here that's backgrounding that I find really interesting. Okay. Now we have this Breita, and the rabbis of the Talmud, the Amoraim, are going to relate this Breita, this earlier rabbinic textual tradition, to this verse. And the rabbis love this. They always love when there's a verse that feels related for them. And you can decide if you think that they're bringing a good related verse. Rabbi Zera says that Rav says, "What is the meaning of that which is written?" This verse that I already brought you. "All the days of the poor are terrible, and for the good-hearted it is always a feast." Okay, so this is our exact question that we were just talking about, right? What does this verse mean? All the days of the poor are terrible. Great. This is referring to a master of Talmud who is wearied by the difficulty of his Talmud study. Okay. And for the good-hearted, it is always a feast. This is referring to the master of the Mishnah, who recites the Mishnah out by rote and is not wearied thereby. So what this statement is, some rabbis who, remember, are engaged with Torah study deeply, one of them is saying that the sort of Talmud, i.e. doing the heavy lift of interpretive work and application, that's exhausting. Mishnah, memorizing earlier traditions and transmitting them, but not doing the work of interpretation, you're just kind of relaxed. Aaron, I like what you're saying in the chat. We need to be careful that this doesn't drift towards prosperity gospel, right? The idea that wealth is about morality. And I think this piece of Talmud actually could be pushing against prosperity gospel in that it's saying, what is wealth? It's actually about our relationships with Torah and tradition. Okay, What do you make of this reading of the verse? None of you, when I showed you this verse, at least as far as you shared, said, oh, this is obviously about different ways of learning Torah. Do you think that's a reach? Do you think that's the rabbis looking into older Jewish texts to try to find something that resonates? Do you think that that this statement of Rav that Rabbi Zera is citing, do you think that maybe he's having a bad day in his learning and he's stressed and wants to express that? What do you think is going on here? And I'd love to hear it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. The study of Torah equals to them all. Great. It's an exercise in comparisons, Leah, yes. For children, for species, the rabbis love to categorize. And they have anytime there's a verse that says like, oh, there's one type and there's another type. Oh, they're like, this has to fit into our world. We love to categorize. That's their whole project. Carol's saying it's a way for the rabbis to place themselves in this venerable tradition of Torah study, right? If verses from the Bible are about Torah study, then the rabbis are making their own project of Torah study much more deeply rooted. Paul, it's another example of the centrality of Torah study. Michael's asking, isn't this just a metaphor? It is just a metaphor. And I want to know why they're using this metaphor. Robert, you're saying they're concerned about the popularity of other rabbis who just mimic Talmud. That's interesting. I feel conflicted about if I think they are passing moral judgments on these different ways of learning. That all the days of the poor are terrible. This is a master of Talmud. It's exhausting. But I don't think that means they're saying that it's bad to be a master of Talmud. But they're also saying that it's good, like it's pleasant and lovely to be a master of Mishnah. And I don't think they're saying that that pleasantness is bad either. Okay, we're gonna move on a little bit.
Can I just add that as my experience is like in learning these things as an adult is that the Mishnah is a lot easier than the Talmud.
Yeah.
That was my first reaction. The Mishnah is just much simpler language. I mean, when you get into it, it becomes more complicated and there's a lot to talk about, and that's why we have the Talmud. But like, there's a reason that children start with Mishnah and not Talmud. And it's not just because the Talmud builds on the Mishnah. It's also because the Mishnah is easier.
Yeah. Yeah. It's both fundamental in content in that the Talmud makes a lot more sense the more Mishnah you've learned. And it's fundamental in that it is so much more well edited. And it's made to be memorizable, basically. Okay, so we had that statement of Rav that Rabbi Zera cited. Rava says, however, and Rav and Rava are different people. They've made this maximally confusing for us. But Rava says the opposite is true. And this is consistent with what Rav Misharshay says in the name of Rava. What is the meaning of that which is written? And here we get another really enigmatic verse. And this is from Ecclesiastes, which is, if you're looking for enigmatic verses, maybe the best place to look in the Tanakh. He who quarries stones shall be hurt by them, and he that chops wood shall be warmed thereby. He who quarries stones shall be hurt by them. These are the masters of Mishnah. So this aligns with some of what you're saying in the chat. They exert themselves to memorize Mishnayot, but since one cannot reach practical conclusions from the Mishnah, they're like someone who's carrying a heavy load without benefiting, right? Mishnah can't tell you how to live. You memorize it, and then what? You're just holding it. You're just a container. He that chops wood shall be warmed thereby. These are masters of Talmud, who attain the benefit of their exertions in the form of practical conclusions. What do you all think? I know this is Paul, you're pointing out in the chat, right? This is a group of people who are here to do Daf Yomi. This isn't a Mishnah group, this is a Talmud group. So I imagine many of you are team Talmud. Yeah, Leah.
Put in really in computer terms, the Mishnah is the program or the operating system, whatever, but the Talmud is what you do with it. how you interpret it. Or, from my background, the Mishnah is the musical score that you study, and
Hmm.
the Talmud is the stage director that has his own or her own opinions. I'm a child of the German Regie Theater, and I've been through quite a bit of crazy opera productions. So I don't know why that came to me, but the Mishnah is very straightforward. That's the stuff you memorize, and then you go and you work in a production and they interpret things. Is it,
Great.
or you're
Yeah.
getting from the pshat as far down as you can go into the sod level.
Great. Yes. And in some ways, right? The whole project of the Gemara, the Talmud, is to interpret the Mishnah and say, okay, we have these rules, but here are all these cases. How do they apply? And Aaron is pointing out the simplicity of the Mishnah makes it more ambiguous, right? And the whole project of the Gemara is to say, okay, but like this word is vague, this phrase is vague. What does that actually mean? And that can be both harder and richer, more rewarding. And Michael's pointing out different people have different skills and strengths, which is how we started out in the Breita, which seems initially non-judgmental, right? That there are just different ways of being good at Torah. There are different places that people are going to be compelled by, different ideas that people will stick with, different ways of interpreting. And that's why we need a range of different kinds of people. Okay, now we're going to do we are doing no jumping in terms of the flow of the Talmud. This is immediately following, but we are jumping in terms of what content is. So now we jump, because we're talking about a verse and the Talmud is associative, now we're going to say, what are other ways to understand this enigmatic verse from Mishlei? Rabbi Chanina says all the days of the poor are terrible. This is referring to one who has a wicked wife. And for the good-hearted, it is always a feast. This is referring to one who has a good wife. Well, I don't love that. I think the most generous read of this is the people we surround ourselves with shape how we experience life. And the least generous way to read this is that it is sexist. And you can choose how generous you're feeling today. Dealer's choice. Okay. Rabbi Yanai has a different interpretation, and he says, all the days of the poor are terrible. This is referring to one who is delicate, the word is istanis, which is a loanword from Greek, and overly sensitive because he constantly encounters unpleasant situations. If you're a person who dislikes loud noises and smells, and like you're very sensitive to the world around you, that can make the world more unpleasant. And I think that in some ways, right, we all have our different sensitivities. This is a very flat way of putting it. But for example, I really dislike bad smells, but don't really mind noise. So like when the garbage hasn't been taken out on my block, I'm having a bad day, but like I'm not bothered by like the garbage truck coming. Whereas for some people, it might be the opposite. And for the good-hearted, it is always a feast, right? The second half of our verse. This is referring to one who is relaxed and not particular. You know, this is really coming for me. I'm a very fussy person. But it's true that the more easygoing you are, the easier a time you're going to have going through your day. And I just want to call our attention to the ways that these are offering such radically different interpretations of this same verse. And we could be reading this as the rabbis are trying to like replace each other's interpretation, but I think it's a better read to say they're kind of riffing, they're playing. They're saying, here's a way to read it, here's another way to read it, here's another way to read it, and they're adding these layers. And they're really adding all kinds of different layers of human experience, too. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan says, so we have another interpretation. All the days of the poor are terrible. This is referring to an empathetic person because he is constantly affected by the suffering in the world. So here we have the poor person in the verse. That's clearly the good one. And for the good-hearted is always a feast. This is referring to a cruel person who isn't bothered by the way others are suffering. So now we have, instead of the poor person being the person who's like worse off and making worse choices, here the poor person is the one who is clearly being viewed as morally better, and the good-hearted here is like callous, uncaring. We've got another one, and here we're going to see this is going to flip again. And Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says, all the days of the poor are terrible. This is referring to a person of impatient disposition. So now we're back to the poor person being someone with the wrong attitude. And for the good-hearted, it is always a feast. This is referring to a person of patient disposition. So just notice how even like which is the good half and which is the bad half of our verse really is in flux. And Uzit points out being highly sensitive has gotten an unfair bad rap. And Robert is asking what happened to balance, right? The rabbis are really trying to get like, we started off, the Breita was about, these are all these beautiful different ways of engaging with Torah. And now we have Brian, like you're saying in the chat, we have all these contrasts. And it's not clear that the original verse is contrasts, but the rabbis love a contrast. They want the verse to be about two poles. And so they're making it, here's one side, here's the other side, instead of representing this spectrum. And Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says, and he has an actual technical question about like the world as it is. He says, is it so that all the days of the poor are terrible? Like if we understand this verse literally, is it true that impoverished people have a terrible life? But aren't there Shabbatot and festivals when even the poor enjoy their meals and rest? What do you mean every day it's bad to be poor? What are you talking about? Don't you have nice, isn't it nice sometimes? And you say, no. Explain this in accordance with the statement of Shmuel, that a change in regimen causes the onset of disease. So if you're not used to eating nice meals and then you have your lovely meals, then actually you'll feel gross after. Well, it's written in the book of Ben Sira, which is a non-canonized book that's roughly like late Second Temple period. All the days of the poor are terrible. Ben Sira says the nights as well. Days aren't bad enough, well, also the bad nights. His roof is at the lowest point of the roofs. The rain of roofs go onto his roof. So everyone else's rain like pours onto the poor person's rain. His vineyard is at the height of the mountains. The soil of his vineyard goes onto other vineyards. So the roof gets all the rain. The vineyard, which needs the rain and the soil, loses the soil. Sort of the like dramatized, almost, I'm thinking of the children's book, Alexander's No Good, the Horrible, many adjectives, very bad day. Where just bad things keep happening. That's this like character that Ben Sira is imagining. Is this person who's always really getting this, just the worst of every situation. And Paul, I really appreciate what you're saying in the chat, right? Most of us don't live at the extremes. We wander between the high and low points. And something that I'm really thinking about, especially putting this section in the context of all these conversations about inheritance, is thinking about how do we hold contrasts. One of the really challenging things for me about this part of Bava Batra has been the way that it's talking about loss and grief and death without really talking about it for the most part, right? Inheritance law, we're talking about cases where someone's dying or someone's died. And yet but we're also talking about cases where maybe that means a windfall for someone. And that one person's tragic loss can be another person's huge gain, or even for the same person, right? We're talking about cases where someone loses a relative and then inherits from them. And I think that this is a really an intense moment for the rabbis of saying, how do we hold all of these contrasts? And they're doing this interpretive work with this verse. They seize on this moment to say, life is really good, but life is really bad. How am I holding that, like, it's a gorgeous day out and the world is terrible? How am I holding that, like, someone I love could be having a really hard time and someone else I love could be thriving? Someone's dying, someone's having a baby. How are we going to live in the world like this? And the rabbis, I think, are pointing to extremes, which I know a lot of you have been noticing in the chat, right? They love a paradigm. They love this person learns Torah this way. This person learns Torah this way. This person's too sensitive. This person's really patient and chill. When in fact, right, some days you're going to be sensitive and some days you're going to be more patient. And I think that the rabbis are offering us this whole series of frameworks so that we can see ourselves in it, right? Some days I'm like, I'm having such a hard day because like everything's bothering me. I'm just really on edge. And some days I'm like, wow, I feel really in a good place today. And so some days I'm going to identify with one part of the verse and the way the rabbis are reading it. And some days I'm going to identify with the other part of the verse. And I think that we can really be leaving this section of Bava Batra thinking about noticing the contrasts and just observing and thinking about what can we learn from the contrasts rather than always resisting or picking a side. Right? The rabbis are dividing sides, but there's not clarity on which side is good from the verse. It's going back and forth, right? Is the poor person a sensitive, emotionally attuned person, or is the poor person someone who doesn't know a lot, or is making poor choices, or is judgmental? We don't know. And that's really what I want to leave us with, is that there's always ambiguity. And in that ambiguity, we can, I think, find what we need and just let things be as they are. And I appreciate the reference to Musar in the chat as well. Yeah, Susan, the different contrasts versus simple binary thinking, right? If we had just one of these, it would be binary. But I think the list of binaries makes it more complicated. And I think that's where I'm going to close us.
Thank you, Rabbi Halpern. I have always had a love-hate relationship with the Book of Proverbs. But this is a really lovely example of the rabbis, toggling between these platitudes, and they will put them out and then we will undo them just as fast with another platitude.
Yes.
And it leaves you to wonder, are we to just pick up the platitude that works for us, or is the like massive platitudes pointing to a more complex reality? So interesting. So thank you all for some lovely active participation and thoughtful comments and suggestions and interpretations. Always learn from you all as well. And we will be on pause next week because in America it's Thanksgiving, so we don't have any staff working that day, but we will be back the following week to continue our journey through Bava Batra. And we are getting close to the end. We're going to finish in December, folks. So I hope everybody has a Shabbat Shalom and is managing the weather, this November weather, wherever you are. And we will see you in 2 weeks. Thanks, everyone.